This is Tyler Merrill, and I'm going to be giving a lesson plan on teaching the violin to Charity. Now, I'm going to start by showing that here I have my prototype violin. It's pretty normal, and I'm going to start off the lesson by showing her this and maybe playing some of the songs that she knows that are popular today, to spark some situational interest and also to give her a prototype of how it's played. When it comes to having a moral dilemma for my lesson, what I'm planning on doing is, the idea I finally came up with is to put at the beginning, I'm just going to kind of read a scripture about music and how music and playing music, such as the violin, can help us spiritually and uplift us. Now, I'm thinking at the beginning of the lesson by starting off by kind of showing her the kind of things that I'm expecting her to be able to start doing or playing, the kind of music that I'm going to start her on. At the end of the lesson, I'm going to demonstrate it, and hopefully this will create some hot cognition. I'm hoping that I'll play things that she'll recognize, which will hopefully stimulate some interest. And I'm also hoping that this doesn't cause any kind of interference, that we are able to stay focused on the lesson, even though it may be things that she recognizes, that we're able to stay focused. I'm going to then come in and show her how I've put tape on the violin here and how these represent different notes that she should be able to recognize because she plays the piano. And so she's already familiar with notes and on the piano or on the violin. So I'm going to have to, like I said, do some evaluation and try to find exactly where her zone of proximal development is, where I want to be focusing and trying to teach her to where it's not something she already knows, but it is something that is within her grasp of being able to accomplish. And I have a pretty good idea of where that is, but I'm just going to concrete it and run her maybe past a couple of drills just to make sure she knows how the notes work. Okay, now one of the things that I'm thinking that it might be difficult for her, that she might have some misconceptions about, is how the violin is played, because it looks simple, like you just draw the bow across and noise comes out, but there's a very certain way you have to do it, and in order to make a decent, good sounding sound. And I'm going to give her some positive examples of how to do it, as well as when you are holding the violin. As such, I have it here. When you're holding the violin, a positive example would be keeping your wrist, as you can see mine, like this. I'm going to show her that. And negative examples, such as like this, when your wrist is up close to the violin, that would be a negative example because it is bad for your wrist. So we'll give her some examples like that. Now, when it comes to the violin, of course, when I'm introducing it, I'm going to have to give her some defining features of it, characteristics, what makes a violin, as opposed to other similar instruments that I could tell her about that share correlational features but aren't defining, such as having strings or having a bow, and compare it to maybe a cello or a viola, which are relatively similar. But there are several things that set the violin apart, such more than just its size and its shape, and I'll go over that with her, make sure she kind of knows how it's different. Now, to be honest, I don't know what kind of personal theories that Charity might have, is how she kind of reacts when I'm teaching, whether I can tell she's kind of picturing like an imaginary audience, which might cause her anxiety to go up while she's playing, or when it comes to personal fables, how she kind of reacts, and when it's her turn to actually start playing and trying to mimic playing scales and things like that I teach her. I'm hoping that when I teach her things that maybe she hadn't previously known, that maybe she had some false concepts or about that maybe she didn't quite understand before, that it doesn't create any kind of sense of disequilibrium, that she's able to take it all in. And I'm going to have to help her with her assimilation of new concepts that I will be teaching her, especially when it comes to actually being able to play the instrument itself. Some of the other things that I may run into, I'm aware there may be some overgeneralization, where she may believe that when you move the bow down the violin, that any kind of movement works, and that any speed works. That all that matters is making the noise, and that is definitely that is an overgeneralization, because there are very specific ways to move the bow. There's also no one way to do it, right? There are many different ways, so it would be an undergeneralization to believe that there is only one way to do it. So I'll have to kind of show her correctly how the bow can be moved and when you want to move it in what different kinds of ways, so there aren't any overgeneralizations or undergeneralizations. Her self-efficacy should be relatively high. Most of my lesson will be covering the psychomotor domain, or at least a good portion of it, because it is very physical. There's a lot of movement when you move your arms to play the violin. Knowing how to move your arms and move the bow, it's very psychomotor. But also there's a very, maybe even an equal part of cognitive domain, because you have to be doing it a certain way, and you have to know what notes you're playing. You have to be aware of mentally of the things that you're trying, the music and the notes you're trying to create. So I'd say it's pretty equal parts psychomotor and cognitive. The affective domain itself will not play quite as big a part in my lesson as the other two, but I will still try to find ways to fit it in with the other domains. I don't know. Some things I don't know is exactly how much she knows about the piano. I know she can play. I don't know exactly what her skill level, her schema is, but I'm hoping that as far as the notes go, that she'll be able to remember it all from her long-term or maybe even short-term memory. I'm hoping there won't be any failures to retrieve as far as some of the notes go, because as long as she knows some of the notes, it'll make the lesson go much easier and smoother, because we'll be able to begin playing sooner if she already knows the notes. So I'm hoping there won't be any failures to retrieve there, and if there are, we'll just go over the notes again and maybe try and use some of the mnemonic devices that exist with instruments to kind of go over and help her remember those. I also have to be careful that, because it will be there, I'll be giving her a relatively large amount of information, and so I have to be careful to make sure that she's being able to store all the information she's giving. There won't be any failures to store it or failures to retrieve when I ask her to try and copy some of the scales that I'm playing. So I'll have to be careful with that. There'll be plenty of extrinsic motivation, because I'll show some music that I know that she's familiar with and play it on the violin, and hopefully that will create the motivation to play it extrinsically. Intrinsically, I would think there would be some motivation in her to learn new instruments. I think when I talked to her, she seemed excited about playing the violin. So I believe there's a fair amount of motivation on both levels. Now, as far as language and communication goes between information and control language, I don't tend to use control language that much. I'm probably going to be using more information language, and I use a lot of cueing, and so I'll be cueing her by kind of pointing to what parts of the violin she needs to focus on, and pointing and motioning as how she should do things, and give her prototypes as well. So that's mostly how I'll be communicating in that sense. And I can't predict exactly, obviously, how her individual physical state is going to be, so I'm going to have to kind of evaluate that and just kind of see how the attribution theory is going, how her anxiety is, and how she's feeling. I'm going to have to kind of evaluate that and adjust accordingly. Inside of my lesson, when it comes to how the brain, her brain is going to function, a lot of it is going to, my lesson is going to particularly delve into the parietal lobe, and how the sensory information the receiver receives there is affected in how she can implement it with her motor cortex when it comes to actually using the bow and playing the violin. Also, in a small part, she's going to be, of course, using her amygdala. Hopefully, we can limit that so the fear and the emotion aren't quite so high, especially when it comes to like stress and stuff like that. And when it comes to Piaget's stages of cognitive development, Charity is in the final one. She's in the formal operational stage, and so she should be able to make reasonable assumptions and to be able to connect the notes that I'm playing with the movements that I'm making with my arm, and she should be able to do the same, and she should be able to make those kind of connections through reasoning. Now, after I've taught her the basics and how to kind of play the violin, and once I get her actually playing scales and things, I'm going to just kind of let her regulate herself, give her a little bit of self-regulation, let her repeat the scales a few times, and kind of let her take it in her own pace while still guiding her and making sure she has sufficient scaffolding. Hopefully, I'm hoping that this works and that it doesn't diminish at all her self-concept or self-esteem, that she's able to not go through any kind of learned helplessness if it gets difficult. And if it does get difficult, I'll have to step in and kind of show her what she's doing wrong and how she can make it better, so she doesn't feel like it's impossible or it's too difficult for her. Okay, so just to recap what my lesson is going to be, I'm going to start out by evaluating her schema, what she already knows about notes and things, and then I'm going to review kind of the notes, and then we're going to move on to setting some scaffolding and giving her some positive examples of how to hold the violin and how to move the bow. And then we'll start with simple scales and how to position your fingers on the violin to make the scale sound right. And after that, we'll move on to playing a simple piece and playing notes and rhythm. And that's kind of the overall just general plan that I have for Charity.